I think the first thing to say is that I come to you as a human, not as some sort of wildly expert clinician. And I am really still very much firmly on my own quest to understand the dramas of my own relationships and attachments in life. And along the way, I've had a few ideas which I've shared with others. So I'm here today really to share what I discovered for myself and in working with some brave couples who were interested in trying something a bit different with me. And one of those couples included me. So, just to be clear, I'm not masquerading as a master clinician. And you'll notice that my talk title is a question, not an answer. And the question is, can you have a great relationship and trauma? So here's a quote. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's an idea that's often, I think, maybe misattributed to the Buddha because it seems to echo his message. But what it means is that life is always going to hurt, but that we have a choice about how we respond to that pain. Now, some responses create additional pain, which he calls suffering. Remaining attached to that response keeps us trapped in our suffering. So I would like to suggest a very bold proposition in this context, and that is that relationships are actually easy. Having healthy, nurturing, successful relationships is easy. It is possibly the most natural thing in the world. And it is, in fact, part of our natural world. Knowing how to have a relationship for most mammals is as easy as going to the loo. It's just embodied. You just do it. You don't have to think about it. So if it's so natural, and if it's the product of 1 million years of evolution, and if it's in our nature, surely we don't have to try and make it work. Well, it's not really that simple. The problem, I think, is not relationships. The problem is our trauma, as in really our unfinished responses to earlier threats. And many of those threats were in relationship and our early relationships. And it's this disconnect in our natural, evolved neurobiological pathways that interrupts the natural ease of having relationships. And that's why pain is inevitable. And so, in a way, we all face a choice if we have a history of trauma. I can either give up on having relationships completely, which is a choice that many people come to after trial and error, or I can be in pain, and that's it. That's the deal. There is no other choice. This is life by Buddha, not by Disney. So then the real question is, if you do want a relationship, how much do you want to suffer? And in a way, that's kind of what this talk is about. It's about how to accept the pain and reduce the suffering, and thus to expand the joy. And ultimately, I think if you get that right, the relationship itself may even be a catalyst to helping you heal your pain. And I think that's the answer to how you have trauma and a great relationship. So the question that this slide provokes is, what do you see in this picture? Now, some people see a mountain and some people see a cloud or weather. Which is it? Obviously, they're both there. So there's a mountain and there is weather on the mountain. And some of you will know a meditation that's based on this idea, which I personally know from the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, but I'm sure that it's been around long before that. And the point is that you are a mountain, and the mountain never changes. The mountain's fixed, it's solid, it's firm. And then there is weather. Weather is ephemeral. It always changes. The only quality that doesn't change about it is that it always changes, rain or shine. And when we love someone, if we really enter into that kind of deep bond, if we really love them, I think we love their mountain, we connect with their mountain. There's something about that we resonate with, something in their essence that brings out that wonderful feeling of love and connection with another soul. And for those of us who did not get enough of this feeling in childhood, and that can be completely intoxicating. We can easily fall in love with being in love. It's just wonderful. But then what happens is inevitably we meet their weather. Now, this can be punishingly difficult. All those warm, fuzzy feelings can get swept away and replaced by fear and dread and anguish and rage and loneliness, you name it. And it can feel very much like the mountain has disappeared, and gone with it is all of our love. So how is that possible? I think in all relationships, to be fair, bad weather is inevitable. And if we have trauma, and if we get confused and think or feel or experience that the weather is the same thing as the mountain, then we will suffer, and we might suffer terribly. But if we remember that the weather is just weather and the mountain isn't damaged by it, just obscured, then hopefully we can still hang out. The mountain remains firm beneath our feet, and the weather is just painful. But it will pass, as all weather always does. The great thing about the mountain and the weather is the mountain never goes anywhere, whereas the weather is always changing. But if we get lost in the experience of the weather, and if we get attached to it, and if we decide this is the totality of our experience, and therefore that we want to change it, that is when we can transform our pain into suffering. But is it possible to bear the pain and reduce your suffering? How could we make that happen? And I'm not suggesting these are definitive answers, but this is what came to mind for me as I tried to, I suppose, nurse my broken heart and protect myself with some ideas. And the three things that I wrote down that go wrong in relationship as a child are abandonment, abuse, and neglect. Can we have a slide for that, please? And this was in no particular order, and I'm sure there's many others, other ways of saying it as well, but this is just what I came up with. And obviously, I major on abandonment, so that was a no-brainer. Abuse is something that as a community of clinicians, we will find sadly familiar. And neglect, I felt, was somewhere between the two. It's not that you're alone or necessarily overwhelmed, but there's something very, very palpable about being not met when you're very young. So perhaps this is the child with the mother at home who's very depressed. There's no absence or unkindness, but nonetheless, something really important is missing. Now, having come up with this, admittedly not particularly original list, I wondered what just these three simple ideas would do to me as an adult. And if I stayed with the idea that relationships are easy, then how would each of these problems divert me from that path? What would change? What would it make me do differently? And I think, I don't know how everyone understands trauma these days. There's so many different ways of talking about it. But for me, I think if I understand it as something that's unfinished, if you like, a kind of reaction to a threat which I haven't completed, then it suggests that whatever traumatic experience or whichever of these three channels we had as a child will remain somewhere active in our bodies or potentially active. So when I form a new relationship, that echo will be there. And then this changes what I need from a relationship, or more importantly, how I need to manage the other person in the relationship. Now, I don't want to be abandoned, abused, or neglected again. I really don't. And yet, the moment I come into close, vulnerable contact with someone else, little fires start to light up in these unfinished areas of my neurobiology and physiology and attachment systems, however you like to call it. And so my unfinished business gets ready to go. That makes me engage in a relationship, but with armor. So if I have abuse in my history, then in my relationship today, I'll probably need to control, because control will stop someone being able to abuse me. Control is basically being able to get people to do what you want. And if I've been abandoned, then I'll need someone to stay next to me. So, gluing them to me will mean I'm never abandoned. And if I've been neglected, then I'll need a lot of attention. If I'm always the one in focus, then I will never feel the pain of my historical neglect. So it's as simple, I guess. I mean, these are obvious, simple solutions to the rather horrible problem that these traumas resurface in my body as I do the normal, natural thing of entering into a romantic relationship. I want a relationship and I expect it to be easy, but I don't want to feel this pain. So I adapt and I do relationships differently. And where does this lead me? So now, instead of a relationship being easy, it becomes a battleground. I start to use a relationship to get power. I use it to get love, and I use it to get attention, instead of whatever it might have been without me needing to defend these wounds. And these needs drive so many of our romantic relationships to an unsustainable imbalance, but they also drive our species and our planet to the same place. I think this trifecta is an epidemic, and we should try and do something about it. So, what can be done? Now, obviously, at the time, I wasn't thinking about what the world needed. I was thinking about me, and if I could figure out how to stop having disastrous relationships that hurt. And specifically, I wondered if there was an antidote for all of this drama. I was hoping that if it could be understood, then it could be changed somehow. I knew that my trauma wasn't going to change, not overnight, but maybe my response to it could be altered, or at least differently understood. But what can you do? If you need power and love and or attention just to be able to cope with being adjacent to another person, how is that going to work? I thought about how this plays out in typical romantic relationships, and it seemed to me, in general, so a need for power leads to someone saying to themselves something like, I'm going to make you do what I want. And a need for love leads to someone saying, I'm going to get you to fall in love with me. And a need for attention leads to someone saying, I'm going to have more fun than you, or I'm going to be more important than you. One of those things, that kind of thing. Again, these were just my musings, and you could come up with different statements that might have more resonance for you for the same underlying needs. I don't think that really matters. I hope you can see that however you frame it, that these really aren't going to be great ways to be in or to set up a relationship for long-term success or happiness. And, you know, as a side note, I noted how many times recently have we heard about narcissistic partners in relationships? And it seems to me that that description is typically how people talk about their ex. They don't tend to have kind of narcissistic friends, or, I mean, you know, they can do, but it's like the bias is that everyone's ex is a narcissist these days. And perhaps in this model, you can see why, because if your relationship fails because these needs have been so triggered that they've been taken to the extreme, which may only happen to that person in a romantic relationship, then that person will, at that point, seem to be very narcissistic, because they might be completely fine when they're not in a relationship. But the trauma plus the relationship makes them controlling, seductive, and attention-seeking. And, you know, what could appear to be more narcissistic than that? So the real problem is that these are transactional statements. This is not a relational way of being. This is the beginning of the other person becoming an object to be used for the medication of trauma, rather than being someone who we meet exactly where they are.